All right, we're live. So, yeah, this is a conversation of three historians talking more about Christian nationalism and U.S. Constitution. I'm going to have Dr. Wilsey introduce himself, and we'll kind of go around.
Okay, John Wilsey. I teach at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I teach church history and philosophy there, and been interested in Christian nationalism and Christian American thesis, American exceptionalism, religion and public life, and religion and diplomacy post World War II for about 15 years. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation very much with these two great historians.
And I'm Dan Williams. I'm glad to be able to be a part of this conversation. I teach history at the University of West Georgia. I've written on the Christian right, pro-life movement, religion and modern American politics, and most recently, a book called The Politics of the Cross, which is designed for Christians thinking about political questions. And although John has written more directly about Christian nationalism than I have, it is a topic that I am interested in.
All right, and I'm Mark Edwards, professor of history and politics at Spring Arbor University, and religious historian or historian of American religion like John and Dan, and been thinking about Christian nationalism for a long time as a scholarly endeavor, but also a kind of personal endeavor, a pedagogical endeavor at a place like Spring Arbor. We think about these issues a lot. So just I'm very grateful that John and Dan were willing to join in this conversation today on Constitution Day to talk about Christian nationalism. This is a subject that has not lessened importance, and in fact, it's one of the most, in terms of our political system and understanding party identification, Christian nationalism is actually one of the most important topics we could be considering. What determines political party identification, race, education level, but do you think America was founded as a Christian nation or not? Or Christian nationalism has emerged in the last two elections as one of the most important predictors of political party identification. And yet, Christian nationalism is a kind of slippery idea. And so I think we'll begin our conversation there. To what extent do we have to talk about Christian nationalisms in the plural, because there really isn't, this kind of one manifestation of this, but it's something that has kind of appeared and disappeared and been used by different groups throughout American history. Let's maybe start there with to what extent are there varieties of Christian nationalism in American history?
Well, yeah, there's Christian nationalism is not new at all. It goes back to colonial founding. You have manifestations of nationalisms that are religious in American context. Those religious nationalisms always appropriate Judeo-Christian themes from the Bible, theological themes, literary motifs, and methodologies as various, in various articulations of national identity, going all the way back to the Puritans. You have just very briefly, you have Puritan millennialism in the 17th century. You have American Revolutionary Christian nationalism that's preached from the pulpits, especially in New England, but also in places like Virginia. You have Manifest Destiny that doesn't start in the 1840s, but Manifest Destiny is a term coined in 1845. And Manifest Destiny takes on itself several different forms in the 1840s and 50s, in the 1890s, and in the World War I and immediate post-World War I context. And then a World War II and Cold War Manichaeism which situates America in a cosmic battle between light and darkness against the forces of evil during the Cold War. Then most recently, you have the Christian nationalism that we're kind of immersed in today. Most readily identified with people like Jerry Falwell Sr., Tim LaHaye, John Eidsmoe, David Barton, Stephen McDowell, Mark Beliles, and people like that, Peter Marshall, David Manuel, and more recently, people like Eric Metaxas and Jerry Falwell Jr. Lots of different ways to articulate Christian nationalism, and they don't all sync very well together. Sometimes they're contested, even among those who espouse them and embrace them. But it has a very interesting history in 400 years.
Yeah, John, I guess I had the advantage of having that first hour with Mark this morning. And so I appreciated the historical overview that you gave there, which I think is excellent, not surprising at all. And I think in some of your own work, you've dealt with some of the complications of this Christian nationalism, particularly I think with John Foster Dulles, that we tend not to think of mid-20th century mainline Protestantism and the World Council of Churches as necessarily being compatible with this sort of Christian nationalism, but as you point out, it very much was in the Cold War context. So I think it's really valuable to have that long perspective. But I guess one of the things that came out of this morning's conversation was the degree to which even today, when we talk about Christian nationalism, we may be talking about different things depending on the context. So when Mark asked me a similar question this morning, I said that there was one could find at least two strands of Christian nationalism on the right that I think work closely together but are not identical. They have different genealogies, and one of those is one that you traced. That is a line going through the Christian right activists of the late 1970s and 1980s, people like Jerry Falwell Sr., who were very much Christian nationalists in an evangelical version. But I think more recently, what we've seen is something that's analogous to the European far right, which is a populist, anti-immigrant, vaguely culturally Christian nationalism that adopts tropes like concern about people saying happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, or concerns about Muslim immigrants, or concerns about a perceived loss of Christian identity in the country.
Yeah.
Toward the end of the session, someone asked me about African-American views, and is there an African-American Christian nationalism? And I think the answer is surprisingly yes, but it takes a very different form than white Christian nationalism. So I think among African-American Christians, there's a widespread anxiety about a loss of faith in the country. At least I see that among African-American students and their families in the Bible Belt. But obviously their party identity is almost always different from the white Christian nationalists, and the particular ways in which they would like to see a closer relationship between God and politics are obviously much more connected to social justice themes than one would find with the common white Christian nationalism on the right. So I think you're right. There are a lot of different varieties of this. So then we might ask, well, what do they have in common? Why do we call all of these things white Christian, or why do we call all of these things Christian nationalism? And what exactly do we mean by that? And I do think there are some common elements in terms of seeing the nation in a particular covenantal relationship with God. But then beyond that, what people do with that, whether they believe that it means something like manifest destiny, or whether they believe that it means staying home from foreign conflicts or something else entirely may vary.
Is it possible to talk about like good Christian nationalism and bad Christian nationalism? As Dan was talking, I was thinking about John's book on American exceptionalism and civil religion, and I think one of the takeaways there might be, or one of the things you were getting at in that book is a Christian nationalism, or just maybe just nationalism that remains closer to the Enlightenment, has served the country better than a Christian nationalism that has maybe been closer to a kind of exclusiveness, tribalism, maybe even to go to a term that was talked about this morning, like a kind of a covenant relation, which encourages this kind of us versus them. That a Christian nationalism that has stayed closer to Jefferson has been maybe better than a Christian nationalism that has been closer to a John Winthrop.
Yeah, or an Andrew Jackson, even. Yeah, I think so. I am an advocate of that. I know that not everybody agrees with me about that, but I am an advocate of that. And I think of there's an excellent book that you probably are both very familiar with by Sanford Kessler entitled Tocqueville's Civil Religion. He wrote it in 1994, I believe. I think it's the publication date for that book. So it's a little bit older. And some of the things he says when he contextualizes, Tocqueville in contemporary issues are dated, of course. But when he talks about Tocqueville's civil religion, he talks about it in terms of an exceptionalism, almost like Seymour Martin Lipset does as an American creed, with various features of that creed, such as rights and equality and rule of law and things of that nature. Tocqueville would add the mores, self-interest rightly understood, and mores that are informed by a Protestant ethic, broadly speaking. But something that he notes in that book, which I think is very interesting for our own context, is that because the civil religion that Tocqueville writes about is something is predicated almost on a secularized morality, what he calls a secularized morality, understood through self-interest rightly understood. That is, that people in America are not virtuous for virtue's sake. They're virtuous because they get something out of actions of altruism. It's in their self-interest, right? To make daily ordinary acts of self-sacrifice. And that does serve as a catalyst for, sort of a civil unity, broadly speaking, and unifies the country. But that unity stopped with the issue of slavery and race prejudice. Of course, he saw that in the 1830s, predicted that there would be a race war, and that would be the way that this intractable problem would be solved. An intractable problem between two different visions for what the country is and what the country should be in the future. Of course, that happened in the Civil War. Well, I do believe that there is a good kind of nationalism that's predicated upon a civil religion that's built much the same, in very similar terms that Tocqueville would say. But I also am warned, and I think we all heed Tocqueville's warning and do so wisely when we look at our own contemporary situation, divided as it is. We have a hyper-partisan civil community where we have competing views about who we are as a nation and what makes us, what our ideals are defined by, and then what are our visions for the future. And in many ways, they are mutually exclusive. And so how far does, a Tocquevillian civil religion, how far does, a sort of a political and social civil religion get us when we are faced with such a challenge. And I'm not sure I know how to address that.
Yeah, I guess seems like there are a couple of questions here. One is there the one you suggested, John, I guess, is there a civil religion that could unify the nation? I think that's the question you're getting at. And then, Mark, your question is there a Christian nationalism that could be beneficent of sorts? And I guess in terms of a civil religion that would unify the nation, I'm not sure that civil religion and Christian nationalism are necessarily synonymous, though I do think there's a relationship there. And I guess I would say that President Biden has tried to find a civil religion that will unify the nation. I don't know how successful that will be, but certainly in the couple months before he was inaugurated, and then right after the inauguration, he has repeatedly tried to draw on civil religious themes in perhaps a deliberately traditional manner. I think perhaps more so than most Democrats in his position would attempt, in the belief this might lead towards some sort of unity in the country. But I don't know. I do think that I do think that the democratic commitment to pluralism, combined with a conservative tribalism and suspicion of that sort of value, is going to make a civil religion difficult. That is, the more pluralistic you are, the more difficult it's going to be to find a common core of a civil religion that is not going to appear anything more than vapid. And the more tribalistic you are, the more suspicious you're going to be of any sort of civil religion. So when you have those two forces competing against each other, it's going to make civil religion really difficult in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
But in terms of Christian nationalism, whether there is a good form of Christian nationalism, whether it could work or not, I guess here I would speaking among Christians, I guess revert to a theological analysis and say that I think from an evangelical theological perspective, Christian nationalism in most incarnations is going to be theologically dangerous. It tends to rely on a conflation of the nation's purposes with God's purposes, often read through a lens that takes promises made to a covenant biblical people and applies them to a nation to glorify American exceptionalism. And I think from most Christian theological perspectives, that's theologically dangerous. I know there's obviously an American Christian nationalist perspective that might not view it that way, but I do think that it's theologically dangerous territory, at least. So I guess from the standpoint of I guess a Christian, I think the most thoughtful Christian writings on Christian nationalism recently have been very critical of that. Nevertheless, I guess I would say that I would share the view. I think the view that you would have, John, that you don't want to see a completely secularized political system, that we don't want to see a system, especially that would be hostile to Christianity. And that may be part of what informs your belief that there could be a Christian nationalism that would be useful to recover. Whether it would be best to call it Christian nationalism or best to call it something else, I don't know. But I would say that I would share your view that Christian commitments would, of course, inform the Christian voter, and concerns about public morality and other matters that are going to be read through a Christian lens, of course, would be part of the concerns that we might have, and other Christians who share a particular evangelical theological commitment would likewise have.
Yeah.
I think when we cross a line, though, is probably when we begin to see the nation as participating in some form of exceptional providentialism, which is what I would tend to associate with Christian nationalism, and reading the nation's history through a covenantal lens that applies biblical promises to a nation that's not part of the biblical story, is where I think things can go off the rails.
Sure, agreed.
I want to move on to the Christian founding question, but before we do, I want to go a little bit further with the nature of Christian nationalism issue, and of course, one of the questions that arises is to what extent is Christian nationalism unique to the United States, and of course, the answer is no, it's not, right? I mean, other countries have Christian nationalism. Dan, you hinted at that there's Christian nationalism among the far right of Europe today, expressing a Christian nationalism. I wonder if we can even go further than that in connections. We're thinking about to what extent Christian nationalism could be compared to Islamism, for instance. Islamism, a kind of a political Islam, a belief that the state or Islam should be like instituted in the state in some kind of way, such that laws reflect support Islam, reflect Islamic tradition, values. To what extent is Christian nationalism and Islamism? To what extent are they kind of akin to each other? I don't know if either of you want to take that question up, but it's a connection I've been thinking about lately, and it might go to, well, maybe certain expressions of Christian nationalism are, and maybe others aren't, or it could just be that that's just a connection that can't really be made at all.
Well, I guess just very briefly, I would say that when you asked the question, the first thing that came to my mind is that if we're talking about the effort to align laws with a particular religious tradition, the first thing that came to my mind was not necessarily Christian nationalism, but Christian theonomy. And that may be a particular variety of Christian nationalism, but I'm not sure that I would say it's mainstream Christian nationalism. It's not generally what we would associate with Christian nationalism. I do think, and here, I'm speaking well outside my field. So, if there was a scholar who specialized in the Middle East, I'd probably be corrected. But from just reading briefly about some of these subjects, I do think there are Islamic movements that are not necessarily focused so strongly on law. So the recent history of Turkey, for example, over the last decade, may be analogous vaguely to what we see with Christian nationalism, which is not necessarily an attempt to change all of Turkey's laws, but a belief that the traditional secular identity of Turkey that it's had since the 1920s needs to be corrected, and that people need to go back to something earlier in the region's history. And so I think that may be vaguely analogous to what we see with Christian nationalism. But I guess I think the point that you're making, or suggesting at least as a possibility we could wrestle with, is the idea that maybe the cultural impulses that have informed Christian nationalism relate to broader impulses that transcend even Christian societies, let alone the United States, and that there is this cultural longing that many people have to perhaps reimpose some sort of imagined identity from their national past in ways that would protect against modern currents that they view as culturally problematic. And if that's what Christian nationalism is, and one could argue, I think that it is to a certain extent, then certainly that's a phenomenon that transcends national borders and has a lot of different incarnations around the world.
And related to that, I'm not an expert on that either. I don't have any business trying to speak into that. But related to the question, I think there's an interesting dynamic I think at play in the various articulations of Christian nationalism in American history that I've been thinking about a lot, that I'd love to bounce off of you. I've not really shared it with anybody, so I'd love to get your reaction to this. It seems as though most articulations of Christian nationalism since the colonial period, maybe even all of them up through maybe the 1950s, up to right before our engagement in Southeast Asia, were oriented historically towards the future, oriented in time towards the future. So, the Puritan millennialism looks ahead to 1,000-year reign, Christ. Revolutionary nationalism, Thomas Paine, we have it within our power to make the world anew. John L. O'Sullivan in the 1840s describes America as a great nation of futurity. Christian civilization under Woodrow Wilson, John Foster Dulles is looking ahead, always looking ahead to the defeat of totalitarian tyrannies and monarchies and kinds of things, to a time when you'd have a world order that was a Christian world order, and that was, dominated by sort of a global consensus around peace and human dignity. But then Christian nationalism since the 70s has been oriented in time towards the past, like you were just saying, Dan, trying to recover a glorious past, as Anthony Smith says in his writings, trying to go back to an imagined ideal past that doesn't, obviously, it can't really be found, but nevertheless, you have these two kinds, broadly speaking, of Christian nationalism, but they're both oriented towards time in a particular way. But with populism, and sort of the populist version of Christian nationalism, Dan, that you were alluding to at the beginning of your remarks, and then also on the left, with regard to critical race theory and things like that, it seems that and even also not just with critical race theory, but also even in some of the critiques of Christian nationalism, it's almost as though that historical, or that orientation towards time, either towards the future or towards the past, is lost altogether, and there is sort of a state of being trapped in the present. And there's really no vision for the future, and that, I think that's true for the populist side on the right. I think that's also true to a certain extent on the left. Both sides are sort of trapped, and then there's also sort of being trapped in the past as well, and an idealistic past, an ideal past. But I think what we sort of are seeing in various kinds of Christian nationalism is an orientation towards time that is almost ahistorical, that we see in contemporary times. I'd love to hear what you thought about that.
It's really fascinating. I had not thought of it in those terms before, but as I was listening to you, I think there's something to that. I definitely think that there has been a loss of optimism on both the left and the right, as you've said. I think that's a relatively recent thing, meaning within my lifetime, arguably even within my adult lifetime. So the question is, what has produced that? Is that something that we've never seen before in American history, or is it just the product of particularly tumultuous time. So I guess I'll give you a couple other times in American history when I wonder if there was a similar loss of faith in the future. And one of those would be 1919. I think with the collapse of Wilson's vision, the rise of isolationist views, the influenza pandemic, and the very beginning of a hedonistic decade. I think at the popular level, there was both a lack of interest in the past and ahistoricism, and a belief that Victorian restraint should be thrown off, and even the progressive dreams should be thrown to the side as well. And the other might be during the 1930s. Certainly, I think President Franklin Roosevelt had a vision for the future, and maybe eventually people came to embrace that. But there was a great deal of popular unrest, as you well know, and a lot of movements that were fringe or not so fringe, anti-Semitic movements and other movements where people simply wanted to recover a mythical identity. But with the people who were tuning into Father Coughlin and really believing what he said, did they have a belief in the future? Did they have anything other than sort of an imagined identity holding them together? So I don't know that we're in unprecedented territory here, but we're certainly not in a good position either. I mean, I don't think we would like to be trapped in 1919 or in the 1930s. And if that's where we are as a country, which we may be, then that's not necessarily a good sign.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, to your point is, has there been a break in Christian nationalism such that it used to be forward-looking and it became more kind of reactionary? I mean, I think those elements have always kind of run through it. So, we could look at kind of post-Civil War Christian nationalism with a sense of moving into better times and heading towards the Christian century, right? Which were not just the country, but the planet itself is going to be substantially Christian. At the same time, you had Americans being arrested for playing baseball on Sunday, right? And why are they being arrested for playing baseball on Sunday? Because they're violating blue laws that go all the way back to the Puritans, right? So, I mean, that's very much a kind of, all right, how much of the past do we need to maintain in the present? The Christian nationalisms of the 1920s, right? Dan and I mentioned this to Dan just at the end of our session this morning, that the Christian nationalism of the Federal Council of Churches is very different than the Christian nationalism of the Klan of the 1920s. So I think in terms of time, I think there's a competition going on. But to your point, is there a kind of break or what is that? What that break? I think you're right to sense some kind of break. It might be. It seems like a lot of the Christian nationalism and Christian internationalisms that I've encountered were treated the state more as kind of a vehicle for the realization of God's kingdom. But what was primary, I think, was God's kingdom, right? And what the country, in this case, the United States, was subservient to a Christian mission, to a Christian purpose, and that seems to, I think that's what is missing in contemporary Christian nationalism, really maybe in Christian nationalism since the 1970s, where there is a much closer identification of the United States and Christianity, or even the United States might even become primary, such that to criticize the United States in any kind of way is akin to a kind of theological heresy. And so that seems to be a rupture, and I don't know exactly what brings that about, but it seems like the Christian nationalism, which saw America as a vehicle for a realization of something greater than itself. I don't want to say that there is a nobility to it, but that seemed to be a little less dangerous than a Christian nationalism, which says whatever America does is right.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but I think that's exactly right.
So we can't really have a conversation about Christian nationalism without addressing that question. Was America founded as a Christian nation? And so John, I'll give you a chance to weigh in on that question. And I asked Dan this morning too, should it matter? Does it really matter if we did or did not have a Christian founding? Should the country in 2021 somehow feel itself bound by a culture or decisions that were made, at a very different time in our history?
Yeah. Well, I don't believe that America was founded as a Christian nation. So I'll go on record for that. And I'm already on record for saying that, and I still believe that. I believe that, having said that, Christian theology does have, a front seat in terms of being a source, an intellectual source for the American Revolution and American identity since the colonial founding, but certainly within the Revolutionary period. The Bible, particularly Puritan theology, is a very important source in terms of revolutionary ideas. There's been a lot of good work done on this question. Mark Knoll, Bernard Balin, Pauline Maier, Gordon Wood, people of that caliber have discussed this at great length. And one of the things that I'm really persuaded by in the work of Pauline Maier, especially, and Bernard Balin, is, you have this disparate group of intellectual sources in the revolutionary period. You have the Bible, you have Puritan theology broadly, you have Enlightenment philosophy, then you have John Locke that almost counts as a category in and of itself. You have classical antiquity, you have common law tradition, and you have radical Whig ideology from, say, 1689 through about 1720. These are all sort of disparate sources, but what Balin and Maier argue is that all those disparate sources are sort of brought together and given a logical coherence by radical Whig ideology. And I do think that that's right. I think that that is a very smart way to think about the intellectual sources of the founding and the connections between those disparate sources. I think very importantly, religious freedom is the First Amendment. The connection between freedom of religion with freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, freedom of the press. Freedom of religion sort of depends on these other freedoms and is unrecognizable apart from these other freedoms that are expressed in the First Amendment. And you see those ties back to those intellectual sources in the Revolutionary period, which gives the First Amendment its coherence and gives religious freedom as well as these other four freedoms in the First Amendment meaning. You see that reflected in those intellectual sources. So was America founded as a Christian nation? Well, another reason why that is a bad question is because it's difficult to know what does that mean. When you look at the people that have argued for that in the last 50 years, they don't even agree with that on that. They don't even really know what they're talking about. Some people think that America was founded as a Christian nation because America was God's new Israel. America is a covenant people. Some people think that, well, America is a Christian nation because most of the people in America were Christians. It was a Christian world at the time, so that's why it was founded as a Christian nation. Others say, well, the ideas, were mostly informed by the Bible and theology and the Enlightenment and other sources really were secondary to those theological and biblical sources. And you know, so there's various ways to answer the question, what even is a Christian nation? And I think that that's part of the problem. If you don't even know what you're talking about, it's really kind of hard to find it in history if you don't even have something in mind or agreement on what it is. Christian nation is too ambiguous as a term to even identify in real time. So that's another problem with it, I think. But as other historians have argued, you know, probably most famously John Fea in his book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? You have this other element that provides a great deal of tension. And it's really interesting. Up until about the 1970s, this wouldn't have even been asked. Everybody thought that America was founded as a Christian nation. I mean, Americans, you know, you didn't even have to be a Christian. You could have been, you know, a non-Christian and said, yeah, of course, you know, America was founded as a Christian nation. This was not up for debate. Americans have always thought that they were founded as a Christian nation. I'm struck when I read Dulles' speeches and writings. It's just a matter of assumption. It's just a fundamental like truism that, of course, we're a Christian nation, and as a Christian nation, we have these responsibilities in the world. And I mean, the entire foreign policy of the United States in the early years of the Cold War was predicated on the idea that America was a Christian nation. This is totally not contested at all until you get into the 70s. And that the Christian nation literature that starts really in 1977 with Peter Marshall and David Manuel's book, The Light and the Glory, is reacting against, you know, the sexual revolution. It's reacting against second wave feminism. It's reacting against the civil rights movement. It's reacting against abortion. It's reacting against desegregation. It's reacting against these social movements, you know, that come out of the late 50s and 60s and early 70s. On the other hand, another sort of interesting question, I think that is really quite brilliantly brought out by Mark David Hall, his book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? You know, when I read his book and I read Fea's book, Fea asked the question, was America founded as a Christian nation? And Fea's, you know, famous answer is, well, it's complicated. It's just entirely unsatisfactory to a lot of people, but it's a great, I mean, he treats it as a historical question. But nevertheless, he asks it that way. And then the way that Hall asks it, did America have a Christian founding? That's an entirely different question. And I think that the answer to that question is easier to answer a little bit more satisfactorily based on the sources. The intellectual sources of the founding are not explicit or not strictly Christian, and it's not a zero-sum game where the Christians win and everybody else loses. The Bible, Christian theology are, you know, a category of intellectual sources that are very important, alongside half a dozen other categories of sources. But still, it's a very important source, and it's you know, it's crazy talk to ignore them or to minimize them in some kind of zero-sum culture war game, which I think a lot of people are guilty of doing, both on the left and on the right.
Dan, I don't know if anything you wanted to add anything to that or respond to John.
Yeah, I would generally agree with you, John. I think that was a good analysis. And of course, I've given you my own answer, which was not very different from John's this morning when you asked me that question.
I'm relieved to hear that.
But I'm kind of intrigued by this question that you asked, Mark, about whether it matters. And I guess to pick up on what John was saying, why did it suddenly matter to people in the 1970s? And I think the answer has to do with a growing divide between mainline or liberal Protestants in their views of morality and evangelicals in their views of morality. I think during the 1950s, the two groups, while they were theologically at odds in certain areas, were not necessarily in very much disagreement over the nature of morality or even the direction in which the country should go. But that changed in the 1970s. And so one group of Christians became much more comfortable with a secularized splinter group of people who had largely left church and were doing very different things than they were with the other half of Protestant Christianity, I guess. And the more theologically conservative evangelicals were, in general, the more uncomfortable they were with the moral direction of the country, particularly in regard to sexual ethics and related matters. And so I think that led to a rethinking of the direction of the country and new interest in this question. And the meaning, I would argue, of the term Christian changed in the 1970s and afterwards in popular discourse. So in the 1950s, if someone said the word Christian, evangelical was not the first thing that came to mind. There were a lot of other things that might come to mind first, including just being a generically good person. But by maybe not the 1970s per se, but certainly by the 1980s, 1990s, increasingly, if you were to use the term Christian in a political context, the very first thing that people, whether Christian or not, tended to think of was a particular type of Christian with a particular type of cultural politics. And that's something that I think has infused this question about whether America was founded as a Christian nation with something that's very anachronistic, because of course, of course, that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the 1770s and 1780s. And so when some historians, or at least journalists, maybe not the best of historians, but at least journalists have tried to answer this question by saying, well, only a couple of the framers of the Constitution would have had anything resembling a born-again experience. Therefore, this was never a Christian nation. Well, that's obviously a rather anachronistic way of looking at it. But at the same time, obviously, some of the claims on the right were quite anachronistic in the way that they were reading the Christian founding. So I guess to add one more complicating dimension to this, I think there's an anxiety on the part of many people, and not just thoughtless reactionaries, but people who are really trying to grapple with these questions, that if we don't have some sort of agreed upon standard with the founding, whether Christian or not, then the question comes, well, what is the basis of our national law? That is, if we have this public debate, as we have had for the last 50 years over national and state abortion laws, is there anything that we can appeal to if we don't have some sort of agreement on the founding? Now, I'm not entirely sure that the answer, that we have to have a founding to get to something that is the basis for the direction in which we want to head, or the direction in which law should go. But I do think that informs the question. And I do think that there's some merit to that argument. That is, if we become persuaded, which I'm not, but if we become persuaded by, say, a secular analysis like David Sahat's works that basically argue that yes, there was, if not a direct Christian founding, well, he would say not the founders themselves were not necessarily intending a Christian nation, but that very quickly became part of the national discourse, and that's something that we should just abandon. I think in his first work, he argued that Jefferson and Madison were people that we should sort of look to for direction. But then in his later works, he says maybe not even that, that really we should be content to just move in a progressive direction. And I guess the problem with that sort of claim, which I think is one that a number of people would make on the left, is that if you can't get agreement on the direction in which you want to go, then on what basis are you going to try to appeal to people? If you can't claim the founding, if you're consciously at odds with the founders, then and you can't get a majority view in support of your own position in your own contemporary time, then what is the authority that you're going to appeal to? And the polarization and the fragmentation of our cultural direction, I think, is something that has given a sizable group of Americans a stronger interest in trying to claim the founding and infuse Christianity into the founding, thinking that if they can find this moral center in the founding and call people back to that, then that's going to give the country the direction that it needs to transcend its current division. And I guess I find myself in the position of agreeing with John that the founding is not exactly going to provide that, and also sympathizing to a certain degree, though not agreeing with the people that believe that if you lose that, you lose your potential for moral direction.
And you got me thinking a lot about Walter Lippmann. Of course, I've been spending a lot of time. He's been my chief conversation partner for a couple of years now, and his career, early on was defined by, okay, so the Christian culture in the United States is dead. I think he said in his first book, the Christian dream is dead. But then the question becomes, all right, well, how do we get along with each other if we don't have some kind of, besides laws, right? Besides laws, you need something more even foundational than that, some kind of agreement or consensus that make those laws make sense. And he struggled with that and ended up in the 1950s kind of coming back to not necessarily to a Christian nationalism, but very much to the founders tapped into this thing that Thomas Aquinas tapped into, that the Romans and Greeks tapped into, that there's this kind of trans-historical tradition of, they called the higher law at times. Sometimes he calls it traditions of civility, but without some kind of commitment to a human dignity, it's really hard to figure out how to get along. And so it's this constant tension running through our history, not wanting to have too strong of a consensus, but the complete, but recognizing we need to have some kind of consensus. For Lippmann, it's a back and forth, right? There is no consensus, yet we need a consensus, right? And it's a paradox. It seems to be one that still is with us today. And thinking about the founding, I would probably be accused of a usable past as well. A usable past. That question: did America have a Christian founding? Tommy Kidd's book, God of Liberty, has probably had the biggest impact on me in thinking through those kinds of issues. And I don't know if this is a fair reading of Kidd's book or not, but what I saw him kind of saying was, well, the Christians of the founding era and the secularists of the founding era, and I don't, secularist might be an acronym to apply to people like Madison and Jefferson, but essentially that's what I see them arguing for, is a not fully neutral public square, but at least one in which the political power of religions is significantly curbed, right? Which speaks to a kind of benign secularism that America worked best when Christians and secularists kind of work together to kind of lay out what the public square is going to look like. And I guess I've often taken that forward throughout American history to say that the Christianity's been best as a political force when Christians have figured out how to get along with people who are not Christians. I've been willing to kind of work with and cooperate and accommodate with them. And you see that kind of in John's book on American exceptionalism as well too. Christians who work more in the context of Jefferson's all men created equal, kind of a more universal civil creed that is sometimes contained in a covenantal Christian theology. I don't know if you both have an extra 15 minutes or so, but kind of the part 3 of this conversation would be getting into the questions of Christian nationalism, the Constitution. And maybe I'll throw out a thesis here that you both can just completely shatter, which is, we know that the Constitution, there's kind of different ways of understanding it. They tend to fall in 2 schools. One is kind of the living Constitution, which is we should try to get at the spirit of the Constitution, not be so bound by the letter. The other is originalist, which is let's stick really closely to the wording of the Constitution as well as the context. And I'm wondering if we rely upon an originalist understanding of the Constitution, if that makes it harder to square Christian nationalism with it. That a more strict reading of the Constitution as originalists call for leaves less room for Christian nationalism. And I'm thinking specifically of the no religious tests for office. Something that kind of sneaks into the Constitution, but seems to me to be really big in answering the question of, can you square the idea that Christianity should have this kind of pervasive influence in our political culture with the idea of no religious tests for office?
I guess I'll say that I'm not sure that's as detrimental to the Christian nationalist vision as what it might first appear. I think as far as the Christian right is concerned, as early as 1980 and ever since then, they haven't really cared very much about the identity of the religious identity of a candidate. In 1980, of course, the Christian right supported Ronald Reagan, who was much less of a churchgoer than Jimmy Carter. In the 21st century, a few Christian right activists had to swallow hard, but then supported Mitt Romney, Mormon, over a liberal but Trinitarian Christian. And then in 2016 and 2020, they lined up behind someone that by most measures was considerably less personally devout or theologically informed as his opponent. So I don't know that most Christian nationalists have cared that much about the religious identity in a strict manner of an office holder as much as they do about a particular vision of the nation. As long as the candidate is willing to embrace that vision, they're willing to support the candidate. I think that's a real change from the 1970s. In the mid 1970s, the vast majority of evangelicals, whether we're talking about Christianity Today or Southern Baptist periodicals, said we need Christians in office. They cared much more about Christian identity in 1975, 76 than they did about a party platform. But in the last 40 plus years, that has not been the case.
Yeah, Mark, I think that's an interesting question. And I guess I'm on the spot, but I don't know if I can answer it to your satisfaction. I guess, historically, conservatives have said originalism, and progressives, liberals have said historically, spirit of the living document. Progressives have certainly said that. But in answering that question in terms of how Christian nationalists, who I think, the most vehement brand of Christian nationalism today is populist, which would be, the way I define populism, it would be right wing, not conservative. I wouldn't call populism conservative, because populism is activist, and conservatism is not activism. Conservatism is the opposite of activism. But populism is certainly right-wing activism, and populism can be as just as forceful with use of state power, when it's their people in office, as people on the left, who they accuse of being the ones who are mostly interested in state power. So both populists on the right and people on the left who are very progressive and seek to use state power to advance their interests, I think both in common use the Constitution for their own purposes. So populists would probably say, yeah, we're originalists, but then they just ignore a clause like the religious no religious test clause. Just ignore that and pick and choose and cherry pick the things that they want. And I think that's also true on the left, picking and choosing the things in the Constitution that they want that will advance their own ideology and their own particular ideological interests for the country. So I think you're not going to be surprised by me saying this, I guess, because I'm a conservative, but I think a more helpful way to approach it would be, if we're going to take, I'll speak for conservatives, people on the right, if we're going to take an originalist view of interpreting the Constitution, okay, well that binds you then to the whole Constitution, all of it. It binds you to no religious tests. It binds you also to the First Amendment, a religious freedom that is, informed by historical definitions of what liberty means in a political context, which is that freedom always entails responsibility, and rights always entail duties and obligations. You don't have absolute freedom we don't live in a consequence-free world. Can't just do whatever we want without any consequences. And you can't just enjoy rights and privileges without anybody else in mind and without duty to your community and obligation to your neighbor in the exercise of those rights. I think that the First Amendment bears that out because it's tied to liberty of the press and freedom to petition and freedom to associate and freedom of speech and those 5 freedoms. I mean, those 5 freedoms, all of those entail duties and obligations to the community as a whole. Christian nationalism that's populist does not have these views of freedom, does not have these views of rights. Rights are for me to exercise, privileges for me to exercise, without any thought or a minimal thought about what that means in terms of duties and obligations to the community as a whole. I think we see that borne out not just in Christian nationalism, but in a lot of different ways for the populist right. So I realize that I might not be getting directly to your question, but it's a very interesting question. It would mean I would need to think about that some more.
No, both great points. It speaks to how consistent are people, I guess, when they follow a particular line in interpreting the Constitution. To what extent does Christian nationalism help open up this document towards a more accurate understanding? To what extent can it cloud it? And we probably could say, well, at times it At times it illuminates it, and maybe at other times it does not.
Yeah.
You probably have both heard somebody say this before. Well, the separation of church and state, that's not in the Constitution. Those words aren't in the Constitution, right?
Yeah.
So maybe our final question for us to take up is separation of church and state. Is that a good interpretation? Right, it's an early one from Jefferson. It's one that Felix Frankfurter, a free-thinking Jew, would apply in the 1950s. Frankfurter was a close friend of Lippmann. He was no friend of Christianity whatsoever. So, I think he took a much more hostile view towards Christianity and a role in public life. So it's worth asking the question: is separation of church and state is that a good interpretation of the Constitution and the Constitution and religion, or maybe the founders and their thought about the relationship between religion and the Constitution?
I think the question would be, what does someone mean by separation of church and state? Nearly every responsible thinker on this question would agree with the principle that some sort of separation of church and state is mandated by the Constitution. Otherwise, what does the Establishment Clause mean? Where the debate usually comes, I think, is not so much as to whether a particular church, a denomination, can receive preferential treatment from the federal government or can have undue influence on the federal government, but rather whether the church, in sort of this vague amorphous idea that stands for a significant wing of Christianity, can inform the values of people who want to argue for a particular position on a moral issue or political question. And if that's what people mean by separation of church and state, of course, that's not something that the Constitution directly addresses. And it's not exactly what it's not exactly what Thomas Jefferson even meant by separation of church and state, or this wall of separation that he talked about. And so I think that has to be acknowledged, regardless of what one thinks about it. It is a somewhat different question. And so I guess I would ask that people define their terms. I think constitutionally, we would have to say that the founders were concerned about a particular type of religious influence on the government or a particular type of governmental influence on religion. But how exactly to apply that concern to the somewhat different questions of the early 21st century, where I think some people would like to short circuit cultural debates about morality and legislation and the direction that we want to go as a country by appealing to that phrase. And without saying that their conclusions are always wrong, I would say that their method of getting to those conclusions is historically flawed. That phrase itself is going to be used in a very different manner from the way in which it was from the context in which it was first created, if it's being applied to those particular questions.
Yeah, I agree with everything Dan says. Great way to put it. One thing I would just add on to piggyback off of what he said, what are the ramifications for the church, for Christian, for Christian denominations, for the Christian gospel, for the standing of Christian people in the country, if church leaders, denominational leaders, begin to speak on political issues, endorse candidates from the pulpit, and those kinds of things. I'll go back to Tocqueville. Tocqueville's instructive on this. He observed in the 1830s that the pastors, the church leaders, they sort of, they didn't involve themselves in the political squabbling of the day. 1831, there was plenty of political issues that they could have gotten involved in. Plenty of moral issues, that they could have addressed during that time. 1831, while he's here, the Nat Turner Rebellion is going on in Virginia. There's plenty of things that he could have, that ministers could have addressed. And of course, we know that they did in various ways. But the one thing that they were able to maintain, according to Tocqueville, was they were able to maintain something of a splendid isolation, right, from the political squabbling, the common, ordinary political squabbling that was going on, which meant that people who were sympathetic to Christianity and those who were not so sympathetic to Christianity universally respected the voices of church leaders, religious leaders, because Christianity maintained this sort of transcendent role in American society. So the church has enjoyed, sort of the universal respect in the culture, because they didn't involve themselves in the political squabbling. If they did, according to Tocqueville, then the people would simply regard the churches as being yet another political faction to be voted against, to be argued against, to be rejected on a political basis, and ultimately their credibility in society would erode, perhaps even to a fatal degree. And I fear that that's a lot of what we're seeing, now. The churches, religious leaders, the faith itself, Christian people do not have the same credibility, that they did, not even since the 50s. I mean, with Dulles, I mean, y'all both know this from your research. John Foster Dulles was, criticized heavily for being, a Puritan, and for being too pious and having too much religious, motifs in his rhetoric, and using his faith to, wield a nuclear tipped sword over the world and all this other stuff. But it's pretty telling when the guy dies. I mean, even his enemies, have to admit, he was a titanic figure that they all had respect for. When he spoke, I mean, even his bitterest enemies, they listened to what he had to say. They respected him. They looked up to him. They considered him to be a reliable, creditable person. And that's just, that wasn't that long ago, and yet it's an unrecognizable world today. So with separation of church and state, sometimes we think, well, what impact is this going to have on our civil community, civil society, on the state? And it also has a bearing on the church as well. I think that the First Amendment gives Christians the right to advocate for their views in the public square, based on theology, based on the Bible, based on tradition, much as anybody else. And I don't think that that's what Jefferson or any of the founders were meaning when they, so Dan's point about sort of an anachronistic read on the phrase is problematic today, for sure. And I wouldn't want to see that under threat at all. But we do have to think, but sort of multidimensionally about that issue and about its ramifications, I think.
How political churches have become in our day is probably, there's probably a lot of exceptions out there. It's probably not quite as extensive as it's made out to be, but there is a perception that the churches have kind of gone all in with the political process, and the churches have become all political, and the image is in some ways more influential than the reality, right? And the image, the perception that the churches are just part of the political polarization of the United States today I don't know if you're seeing that in your circles, but it does seem like it's driving young people away from Christian institutions, if not from the Christian faith in general. So it's, this was a tactic that Christians thought they could use to remain relevant in American society. It's one that doesn't seem to be working out for them. I hate to end on such a such a negative note, but it's going to be an interesting decade, particularly to see if churches can hold their young people, can bring them back, and how exactly that's going to work out. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. This will be great. I know that my students will be partaking of this and have a great time with it. So thank you so much. And I'll process this video and get a copy out to you both as well too. But
Right. Thank you.
thanks again. You guys have a great weekend, and wonderful talking with you.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks.
very much.
Appreciated it.
Appreciate it.